This episode is brought to you by Indeed. Stop waiting around for the perfect candidate. Instead, use Indeed sponsored jobs to find the right people with the right skills fast. It's a simple way to make sure your listing is the first candidates see. According to Indeed data, sponsored jobs have 4 times more applicants than non-sponsored jobs. So go build your dream team today with Indeed. Get a $75 sponsored job credit at Indeed.com/podcast. Terms and conditions apply.
Disney Plus wants to know, are you ready? For Marvel Studios' Thunderbolts, The New Avengers, now streaming on Disney Plus.
Let's do this.
One of the best Marvel movies of all time is now streaming on Disney Plus.
Hey, you weren't listening to me.
I said Thunderbolts, The New Avengers is now streaming on Disney Plus.
Meet the New Avengers.
That's a cool name.
Marvel Studios' Thunderbolts, The New Avengers, rated PG-13, now streaming on, you guessed it, Disney Plus.
This is the Tudors Dynasty and Beyond podcast. History with a twist. And now your host, Rebecca Larson.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and I'm so happy to welcome back again Dr. Linda Porter. Welcome.
Hello, Rebecca. I'm glad to be back again, even if my voice is not entirely with me.
Well, I am pleased to see you. We will bear through the voice issues, even though I don't notice them. So I think we'll be okay. But I invited you back again because we were doing the Queen's Husband series with you.
And I'd like to apologize to your listeners for this being a bit spasmodic. It was to be an occasional series anyhow. But to cut a long story short, we've had a hell of a difficult autumn with all sorts of personal problems and a lot of illness. And I'm only just sort of emerging from that. And with other commitments as well, it's not been easy. But I'm pleased to get to William III because it takes me back into the Stuarts.
Yes.
And while thinking about it this morning, I thought, this is really a lot more complicated than the Tudors, which it is, because it's 100 years closer to us in time, because there are so many more sources, and because the type of sort of geopolitical and religious and other problems have expanded exponentially, to use an overworked phrase. But it is absolutely fascinating. And it reminded me, on thinking about William, that I would have liked to have written a book about his marriage to Mary II. But my publisher wasn't that keen, which is sad. The later Stuarts are immensely complicated, but it is the period. I mean, the marriage of William and Mary was the marriage that made modern Britain. It changed everything. And he is one of our least known and least loved kings. But he was a major European figure in his own right. And without him, Louis XIV might have trodden all over Europe. So I think he is a very important man, maybe not terribly lovable, though his wife came to love him very sincerely, I think. But he isn't well known. Probably certainly of the kings in the modern, monarchs in the modern, if you take sort of from the late 17th century onwards as modern, he is probably the least well known, while being one of the most significant. He isn't a man that's easy to like, I don't think, but nevertheless, he is a crucial figure. So I'd like to talk a bit more about him, but if you've got any questions you'd like to ask to begin with, then fire away.
Yeah, I think maybe we should just kind of set the scene a little bit so people understand who they were, both William and Mary. I mean, I recently had Breeze Barrington on to talk about Mary of Modena. Well,
Breeze knows a lot more about this than I do, probably, or at least about Mary of Modena. And of course, she had to cover some of this as the background. But let's go back to William himself, because I think what a lot of people don't know, I mean, he's always referred to as William of Orange. And Orange itself is in the south of France, which is rather bizarre. But it was part of the territories that had sort of accumulated, if you like, to the princely house of Orange-Nassau in the Netherlands. And so William is, interestingly enough, half a Stuart, because, of course, his mother was Princess Mary Stuart, the first Princess Royal, who was the eldest daughter of Charles I and Henrietta Maria. and who, given her what happened to her, I should think, the number of people who become hysterical about Elizabeth I and Thomas Seymour probably don't understand that Mary and William were married when she was 9 and he was 15, which I think rather puts Elizabeth and Thomas Seymour in a different perspective. Now, of course, they didn't immediately live together, though they started to live together much sooner than was anticipated. But you need to remember about William that he is half a Stuart. And this is the key to his finally becoming king. And in fact, while Charles II and James II lived, before the birth of the so-called warming pan baby in 1688, the Prince James Edward, William was the male heir. He was their nephew, and he was a Protestant, which was likely to appeal to many British people. And he had a very difficult and lonely upbringing in many respects, and a difficult apprenticeship in politics and warfare, though he would become quite competent, well, more than quite competent at both. But his mother was Princess Mary Stuart. He was born on the 14th of November, 1650, just days after his father's death. His father was William II of Orange. And as I said, he'd been married at the age of 15 to Princess Mary Stuart. She was disdainful, even as a child, about marrying, this rather beneath her, a foreigner who wasn't a member of a kingly dynasty, shall we say, although the House of Orange did go back a considerable number of years. And of course, he wasn't a king. And the country that he was in was a republic. He held, or his father had held, and so some of his predecessors, the rather amorphous role of stadtholder of Holland, just Holland, not the other provinces, because you remember the United Provinces are 9 provinces making up what is, broadly speaking, modern Netherlands, or it's still called Holland, but that's a misnomer. Holland was only a part of it. So William's family had this sort of largely decorative, partly military, partly political role in a country that had fought a long and tremendously draining battle to free itself from the rule of Spain during the 16th century. And it had become a republic. The Spanish Netherlands to the south was still, obviously, their modern Belgium, were still ruled by Spain. Though, interestingly enough, Spain would become something of an ally of William later on against France. But he was born in November 1650 on his mother's 19th birthday. She had just lost her husband to smallpox, but their marriage had been extremely unhappy. I mean, there's that charming portrait of them. Mary in her wedding dress of cloth of silver, and William all sort of appropriately dressed up, looking like a rather handsome teenager, but they didn't get on really. I mean, the Mary came over there in difficult circumstances, pulled along by her mother, Henrietta Maria, who was willing to dump her daughter there essentially well before she would have been considered of cohabiting age, in return for the Netherlands' support against the parliamentarians in England at the beginning of the Civil War. So it's a difficult background. Mary, William's mother, always hated the Netherlands. She never really learnt more than a few words of Dutch. She used to communicate in French. She was very much her father's daughter. She looked like him. She was proud. She was sort of contemptuous of any of her opponents. And although she had her aunt there, the exiled Elizabeth of Bohemia, and a whole flock of rather merry cousins, actually, she took her entire household with her, incidentally, but she always felt, I think, that she was an exile in a country that she was too good for, that she didn't like, and that was embarrassingly a republic, when her own parents had put her there while trying to fight off Republicans essentially at home. I mean, that is a very unhistorical in many respects definition of the civil wars. And of course, in in 1641, 1642, when she went across with her mother to the Netherlands, there was no inkling that England would become a republic. There were obvious considerable difficulties with Parliament, which were going to get worse. But so William was born into this kind of unhappy background. His father having died, he was a womanizer, the father, and drank too much as well. But very much the apple of his mother's eye. Creeping into all of this, there is William's grandmother, who would become essentially partly responsible for his upbringing later on. The redoubtable Amalia von Solms, who was a German noblewoman and who thought that she was just as good, if not better, than the Stuarts, even though the Stuarts had been around as monarchs since the late 14th century.
Instagram teen accounts have automatic protections for what teens see and who can contact them, plus time management tools. And Instagram will continue adding built-in safety features to help create age-appropriate experiences. Learn more about teen accounts and Instagram's ongoing work to protect teens online at instagram.com/teen accounts.
In Scotland, of course, but as far as, one-upmanship was concerned, Amalia was very good at it. She couldn't stand her daughter-in-law, and the feeling was mutual. So William grew up with this rather awkward family background, and he lived in his mother's household in The Hague for about the first 3 years of his life. But of course, during the 1650s, Mary, who was a staunch supporter of her brothers and of the Stuart cause, spent a lot of time away. She travelled with Charles II quite a lot. And William didn't see very much of her. She was, however, a very fond mother of her son and quite concerned about him. And in 1660, after her brother's restoration, she came across to England in the autumn of the year. And first of all, Prince Henry, whom she had loved and supported very much, died. And then towards the end of 1660, Mary herself fell ill with smallpox, which eventually killed her, probably due to the tender ministrations of the doctors at the time, who were always keen to bleed you to death if they possibly could. Whether she would have survived or not, we don't know. I mean, people did survive smallpox. It was survivable, though not always. But anyhow, she died on Christmas Eve, 1660, leaving a very detailed will. And huge debts, because she'd always lived. The one thing the Stuarts were really good at was living beyond their means. They all knew how to do this wonderfully and were really, really good at it. And she was no exception. So William, of course, was left as a 10-year-old boy, too young to really aspire to any of the roles that his father had had within the Dutch Republic. His position looked upon rather enviously by various older cousins who were in some of the other provinces that made up the United Provinces. His education was largely taken over by the Republican leader Jan de Witt, whom William both feared and admired, I think, in about equal measure. And so he continued, for some time, until the Dutch grew tired of de Witt, and eventually he was actually assassinated and executed. And William had been brought up under the sort of opposing forces of Granny Amalia and Great Aunt Elizabeth. And this was not a happy childhood. Much of it he spent fairly alone, I think, but he was also a boy of indifferent health. He suffered badly from asthma. He was very short, always. He never grew to be very tall. And although in his portraits, he doesn't, to me, actually look ugly. I mean, he's got the Bourbon nose. And of course, you've got to remember, he has got French heritage through Henrietta Maria. He looks very much what he was, part Bourbon and part Stuart. And I think if you just seen the picture without knowing some of the other surroundings, you'd think, well, what is all the fuss about? And why on earth did his sister-in-law, Princess Anne, call him Caliban, which is not very flattering, to say the least. But he when he did eventually marry Mary, his cousin, she towered over him. Like Mary, Queen of Scots, a lot of the Stuart women were very tall, and she was as well. But he also, I think, suffered from the considerable difficulty of being, perhaps an heir to the English throne, well, and the Scottish throne as well, of course, because it wasn't Britain then, but was about to become so, not that long after William's death. And his uncles both wanted, they didn't want to acknowledge him as an heir, yet he obviously was in reality. They wanted his support in some ways, but of course, William was always, from quite a young age, after De Witt's death, he did have really a laser focus on opposing Louis XIV. Without him, I think Louis would have, as I said earlier on, really probably rampaged over much of Europe. And it's greatly to William's credit that he took on this role as a kind of Protestant saviour in a country that had suffered badly in the previous years in its fight to become free. But of course, it's often overlooked, but there was a great flowering of Dutch culture at this time. And particularly, you have to excuse me, I wrote this down because I can't exactly remember when. But I think at about the time that William sort of finally came into his majority, the great painting, the Night Watch by Rembrandt was painted. And so, in all sorts of, in literature, arts, painting, pottery, all these kind of things that became very much associated with the Netherlands later on. It was a great flowering of Dutch culture. In the 1650s, of course, there'd been war between the English Commonwealth and the Cromwellian period, and there would be again under Charles II, with largely terrible humiliation for the English, which we don't hear about very much, but it did happen. And William was keen on trying to build up a better army and also a better navy. And probably with the navy, he succeeded, I would say, sooner than the army. And for much of the 1660s and 1670s, he was trying to improve his position and try and get back to the kind of more golden age of the stadtholder. He was always at odds with Amsterdam, which, being the major city, this was a problem. I mean, the Dutch were very jealous locally of their local power, and it was a republic in which, at least ostensibly, things were done by agreement between different of the provinces. And William in the 1670s really did not adequately succeed in his own terms in uniting the Dutch to be willing to put in the effort and the money to oppose Louis XIV. And so it was that in the late 1670s, he married his cousin Mary, partly because the brothers James and Charles thought that this would be good for them at home, because William is a Protestant, and partly because William himself knew, of course, that Charles had no legitimate children. He had supported the Duke of Monmouth, which didn't go down well. He came to England from time to time, and he had none of the, he was like a fish out of water in the Restoration Court. He didn't womanize, he didn't drink. When Charles tried to get him to do these sort of things, he just made a complete fool of himself. He didn't enjoy having to dance with the king's mistresses, all this kind of thing. But he was 27 when he married the 15-year-old Mary. And Mary was distraught. I mean, she'd had this rather inadequate upbringing for someone who was so close to the throne. She liked romances and writing sort of romantic letters to women friends. I mean, whether or not you think this has anything to do with same-sex friendships, I leave that to my friend and colleague, Dr. Gabby Story, who will be writing all about this fairly soon. I'm not sure that I agree with Gabby, but, her views on this are very interesting, and she's done a lot of work on it. But I mean, it seems to me basically that Mary had a schoolgirl crush on some of the women that she wrote to, and this was perfectly. I mean, it happens all the time. Why it should be thought remarkable in the 17th century, I don't know. But Mary didn't want to marry him. She cried for days when she was told that she was going to have to. Because, bear in mind, this is an attractive and in her own way quite lively young woman, aware, I suppose, of her position in the English succession right after her father, James. And at that stage, poor Mary of Modena had quite a few children who died young. Some were boys, more were girls. But it didn't seem, it seemed probable that after James, Mary would succeed. And married to William, of course, this would have an interesting effect on not just England, but Europe. And one of the things I think it's interesting to remember about William and his overall position as Mary's husband, which, given the extraordinary hype over centuries about the so-called Glorious Revolution, and it, as a child, we were fixated. This was the Protestant wind that blew William across in November 1688, and it was a fundamental part of our history, which it is, but perhaps not for the reasons that we were taught. But this takes William, that view, completely out of the European context. And the important thing to remember about William is the European context, the wider context in which he always saw himself, and which was perhaps his overriding aim to influence and be a major player in. So he married Mary, and she cried all through the ceremony. It must not have been too much fun. And they were bedded together with Charles II making various, lewd and ribald remarks, which can't have helped anything either. But what is rather extraordinary is that Mary departed with her husband fairly soon afterwards, sobbing to Mary of Modena, Mary of Modena saying, well, I came over as a 15-year-old. And Mary saying, yes, but you came to England and I'm leaving it. Certain lack of sensitivity on her part to her stepmother. And I've always thought that the decline of the relationship between Mary II and Mary of Modena is very sad. It's one of the saddest things in the late 17th century, because I'm sure Breeze talked about this when she talked to you, but it is, Mary of Modena had tried her hardest. And her husband said to his daughters, I'm bringing you a plaything, another playmate. Because she was so much younger than him. And she had supported them staunchly and travelled with them and tried to, help them and helped to steer them through a debauched court when she herself was trying to deal with that. But Mary did set off with her husband and soon became very, very fond of him. There were certainly one and possibly two miscarriages. I think, she tried to get pregnant too quickly. And it became apparent, really, by the time she was in her early 20s, that probably there would be no children of this marriage, which is a factor in itself in everything that was to happen subsequently. And she found that she grew very fond of William and he of her. There is all this question about William's sexuality as well. And he does appear to have had a relationship with Elizabeth Villiers, who later became Countess of Orkney, who, like most of James II's mistresses, was apparently as plain as a pikestaff. Charles couldn't understand the taste that his brother and nephew had in women. But nevertheless, while in the Netherlands, Mary became her own woman, if you like. And she was very much a part of the sort of growing culture there. She developed a huge interest in gardening, which she would later show to very good effect in Hampton Court, and in, architecture and building structuring. She was a great collector and connoisseur of porcelain and art. And she later said that the years she had spent in the Netherlands were the happiest of her life, notwithstanding her concern about William's relationship with Elizabeth Villiers, because, there's this famous incident which she actually confronted him on the back stairs between their apartments and everything, and had a scene, and he tried to calm her down and all that. But they were nevertheless a very close couple. And by the mid 1680s, of course, Charles II dies in 1685. William and Mary had made themselves unpopular with Charles to the point of, stopping all communication, really, by supporting James, Duke of Monmouth, which they may have done not so much to cause trouble, but because they were mistakenly under the impression that Charles was very fond of Monmouth, which he was, but he wasn't fond, after the Rye House plot, of anyone essentially trying to be involved in assassinating him, which is understandable. So really, by the mid 1680s, well, certainly by 1687, it was apparent that the reforms that James II wanted to make, which were ostensibly to encourage toleration of both nonconformists and Catholics, but were also going to have a profound effect constitutionally and politically, were anathema to the English ruling class. And William needed England's support if he was to be a serious contender in the ongoing fight with Louis XIV. He was personally brave, but his various forays into military engagements had not really been terribly successful in the 1670s and early 1680s. And of course, in his wife, he has a legitimate alternative to her father and his uncle. And these family relationships are very fraught. James, in his rather careless way, was very fond of both of his daughters. I don't think he was ever that fond of his nephew, actually, but, it's a very tricky situation. And William began essentially to arm and to collect a fleet, which he could invade England with, if necessary. And of course, he didn't want James to drift more and more into Louis XIV's orbit, as Charles II had done, for all sorts of reasons, both personal religious belief and his wider European agenda. He could not afford that. And his wife was well placed to legitimize his own position, whatever that might be, in England, Scotland, and Northern Ireland, Ireland, of course, as it was then. It wasn't separate. And so he responded eventually to this famous letter from the Seven, whose names I can never remember, to come over and free them from tyranny, basically. And so he did. And again, it's because it was so caught up in the Protestant English view of our history, it's forgotten that this was an armada. It was an invasion of the last invasion, in fact, of these islands. But it's all kind of glossed over because it was okay, because they were Protestants and they were going to be William and Mary. And the eventually, of course, as you know, James bottled it and left. He had sent Mary of Modena and his son. I mean, the actual occasion for the movement of all of this forward, the invasion and everything, was the birth in the summer of the so-called warming pan baby, Prince James Edward. And I don't think many people nowadays, despite, all the nasty rumours put about by Mary's sister Anne, because of course Mary's in the Netherlands during all this time and has to rely on Anne and others for an understanding of what's going on in England. But I don't think anybody seriously thinks that the baby was a substitution. It's all very well to say, oh, well, Mary of Modena hadn't been pregnant for years. She hadn't been pregnant for quite a few years. And she'd singularly failed to give birth to a child that would live for more than 3 or 4 years. I mean, but after the old pretender, as he became known, she did also have another daughter with James. So, clearly, and the poor woman, as you know, gave birth in the most appalling circumstances, with everybody looking and all that. I mean, we tend to think that monarchs led a charmed life, but I don't really think that, having all of your lady parts obvious while you're trying desperately to give birth in front of a suffocating room full of men is really something any of us would swap even for a crown nowadays.
No, definitely not.
It's really not a nice idea. So, um, William came over. Initially, it was sort of unclear what would happen, but James made it easier by leaving, petulantly dropping the Great Seal of England into the River Thames en route, as if this would somehow stop everything and there would be no further legislation. It's not difficult to make a new one. So I don't think the circumstances were necessarily those that William and certainly Mary would have chosen, but it was the right time, perhaps the only time, if this change was going to be effected. Mary did not accompany him. She didn't come over until several months later, the following April, in fact, when they were crowned. And the condition on which William was accepted as monarch and William III was that it would be a joint monarchy, which was unique. There was no precedent for this. I mean, not just in England, but I can't immediately think of one in any other major European monarchy, certainly at the time or before that. William was fine with this so long as he had all the executive power. This doesn't, however, mean that Mary was just a figurehead. She took the business of supporting him and being left de facto in charge of government, because he was often away on military campaigns. And there were some awkward losses, like the Battle of Beachy Head, which the English actually lost to the French, and Mary had to deal with the fallout of that. Of course, she was supported by a council, but she took this very seriously. And if she wasn't the sort of woman who would have made decisions entirely on her own, she certainly wasn't just sitting there rubber stamping things. And without her, William would have had a great deal more difficulty. And he knew this. And I think in his own rather curmudgeonly way, well, he was a man certainly lacking in personal charm, it has to be said, though fiercely loyal to a very small coterie of personal friends, people he had known through all of his time in the Netherlands, who would become a British nobleman, well, English nobleman, then British later on, Bentinck and people like that. And he, I think he did respect his wife for this and understood the role that she was playing, while, I mean, he wasn't a queen's husband in the sense that Philip II, of course, had more power than most people thought. But I mean, William was actually, I mean, he was king, and not just in title, but in substance as well. And in the Bill of Rights and some of the other great documentation of the late 17th century, it did forge the basis of an unwritten constitution, or at least a constitution that existed in various different acts of parliament and that. I mean, it isn't quite right to say England didn't have a written constitution. It just didn't have anything called the written constitution, but it had all sorts of elements that made it up. And William wasn't a man who ever courted popularity. He left Mary to do that, and she was much loved. She was rather retiring, but realized early on that they needed to appear in public a lot as a couple. She was very devout Protestant. He, of course, William had Calvinist influences in his upbringing, but Mary was very interested in the Anglican Church and in pursuing its position in daily life, really, in the country which she'd come back to. She's probably, I suppose, best remembered for the great deal of work and effort she put into not transforming, but certainly changing quite a lot Hampton Court. I mean, currently at Hampton Court, there's the wonderful James, who is one of the major curators there, and who has got this Queen Mary II blog, which is and he posts quite a lot on social media, and it's well worth looking at. And he was very disappointed when I told him recently when we met at Hever. I said I'd wanted to write about William and Mary, but, there was some polite interest. And then I mentioned Elizabeth and her suitors, and there was this sort of totally different reaction. And I know some people don't understand. I remember a woman saying to me not that long ago, quite amazingly, why do you write books that you don't want to write? And I said, it's not that I don't want to write them. They were not necessarily the first choice. So what are you going to do? Are you going to sit around sulking for 3 to 5 years, or are you going to move on to something else? And I would like to have done it. And I did some research on it and realized it was enormously complicated, because trying to put all of this over, if you reduce these kind of historical figures and developments to the kind of basic Six Wives of Henry VIII nonsense, and a lot of it is, I regret to say, it's just the same stuff being churned out again and again and again by influencers who you would think had never known anything about this in the past. But it is this century, the late 17th century, in which, for better or for worse, ultimately a Great Britain is forged. And the people involved in it are not like us, of course. They had rather different preoccupations, but they are closer to us, I feel personally, than people in the Tudor period. And I think William is a prime example of this. I mean, he is not just he is not at all a token king. I mean, he was the third King William. I mean, when you think back, there hadn't been one since William II, and he was a bit of a disaster, to say the least. I mean, it's not going to get yourself shot with an arrow in a hunting accident in the New Forest, and he remains another of the kings that people know very little about. And William is in this. He's got the same name, as it were, but is centuries and centuries apart. But while he wasn't going to be a consort king, he did understand that his position vis-a-vis his wife was an unusual and unprecedented one, and that they had to work together. And initially, I think what is not very widely known, and which I'll talk a bit about in the next husband, because of course we've got the two Stuart husbands very close together with Anne and with Mary and Anne, is that initially, conscious of the importance of public opinion being on their side and on the need for visibility, which doesn't really come naturally to either William or Mary. And then they're not the sort of hail fellow, well met. Though I think we have a quite wrong view of Elizabeth I and Charles II, in which we think they were, jolly people always going out to meet and greet. The bloody hell they were. Certainly Elizabeth. I mean, Charles II did actually have some interchange with his subjects from time to time, particularly during the Great Fire of London. But Elizabeth tried to stay as far away from her subjects as she possibly could. One of the many other myths about Gloriana, but William and Mary were not natural to do this kind of thing. It didn't have any real appeal. And they did realise the need of working with Mary's sister and brother-in-law to give a united family front. And it is quite interesting. You see them doing this in the first years of the reign until the strains between Anne and Mary became more apparent. And of course, William was often away, as I said. He left his wife in charge with a council. And although she didn't really want the responsibility, she took it on quite effectively. She's often just viewed as a kind of cipher, William and Mary, and she's the and Mary bit of it. But she had more agency, to use an overworked modern term, than people thought. And she, obviously she did put on weight and all that sort of thing again as she got older, but she was, as was Anne. If you've seen portraits of Anne as a princess, she's a very good-looking woman. And we don't have many beautiful queens or princesses, truthfully, in our background, but these two Stuart princesses, when young, were really very good looking. And so we should remember them for that as well, I think. But of course, in 1694, Mary caught smallpox. I've never quite understood, and I'm not sure. I'm sure there must be some social historians or even medical historians who could comment on this better than me. And that might be an interesting area to go down, actually, medical history. A lot of it has to be conjecture, but the closer to get to modern times, the less it is. Smallpox stalked the aristocracy at this time. I don't know whether it was also very prevalent amongst the lower orders as well, but you have Prince Henry, Charles and James's younger brother. You have then Henry himself. You have Princess Mary Stuart, the Princess Royal, and then Queen Mary II, all dying of smallpox. And one wonders whether there was something about court life and the proximity to people that sort of made it more dangerous. And it was of course, Elizabeth nearly died of it in the early 1560s, but being Elizabeth, she survived. Many others didn't. And Mary, as soon as she realized that she'd contracted it and that it was very serious, because she didn't respond well to early attempts to treat her, shut herself away and wouldn't let anyone see her. Which at least shows some understanding of how the disease was transmitted, and spent her last days burning quite a lot of her personal letters, which is terribly sad, because there must be a whole record in there that we don't have, covering both her time in the Netherlands and her time in England, and of course eventually died. And William was distraught at her death. He really was. I think he felt he had not, perhaps on a personal or even a political level, behaved towards her as he might have. And he knew her devotion to him. And of course, he never remarried. And they were not, in absolute terms, a sort of photogenic couple. This very short, pockmarked man, because he'd had smallpox as well, asthmatic and often having trouble breathing, with this tall, statuesque, chestnut-haired beauty, and is really a kind of strange image. But yet there is more to both of them than that. And William, of course, ruled on without her because he had been permitted to do that. He did name Anne as his heir, and for a while, of course, her only son that survived into anything remotely approaching adulthood died at the age of 11, the Duke of Gloucester. But I mean, he would have been an heir had he survived. William nominated Anne. It was agreed that she would be his heir, even though, of course, she didn't have any children who were likely to survive herself. Though it was still hoped that she would do, even after she became queen, of course. But it's quite a sad marriage in some respects, but perhaps not as both banal and dismal as people sometimes present it as being. And I think he is a genuinely overlooked and undervalued monarch, perhaps less for the glorious revolution, but for the fact that he was determined and saw it as his destiny to oppose Louis XIV from just steamrolling over the whole of Europe. And of course, Louis XIV had his eyes on the Spanish Netherlands, and William had to make and be quite agile in making a number of political alliances, which were perhaps not necessarily to his taste. And of course, the legacy he passed on was a country that was ready and able to go to war. The great victories against Louis were, of course, won by Marlborough, who'd been both loyal and disloyal to William, and loyal and disloyal to James II before that as well, and who was very persona non grata for a while with William. But the foundations for this were laid in there. And of course, William is the monarch who took us into the 18th century, because he did die in 1702. And his legacy, I think, is not just many aspects of the country and great international player that Britain, as it became with the Act of Union in 1707 under his sister-in-law, but also in putting at least a hold on the ambitions of France. And I think that for someone, who lost his mother when he was 10, who'd been virtually pulled apart by his mother's dislike of his grandmother and then his great aunt's dislike of his grandmother, it was a difficult inheritance. And behind it all, I think the final thought I'd like to make is that he may have been portrayed, and perhaps still is, in British popular history as a Dutchman, but he was half a Stuart.